People never ignore you by accident. Have you ever noticed how someone who used to answer your messages within minutes suddenly acts as if you no longer exist? No explanation, no argument, just silence. Most people assume this kind of behavior is random. They tell themselves the other person is busy, distracted, or simply forgot. But have you ever wondered why silence often appears at the exact moment something changes between two people? I am the watcher, and here in Shadow Insight, we don't chase excuses. We observe the hidden mechanisms that quietly shape human behavior. The strange thing about people is that they rarely reveal their intentions with words. They reveal them through attention, because attention is one of the most valuable things a person can give, or deliberately take away. Tonight, we're going to uncover why people suddenly become distant, why being ignored is often a psychological strategy rather than an accident, and why the real reason has almost nothing to do with what most people believe. By the end of this video, you'll recognize the invisible mechanism behind silence, and you may never interpret someone's absence the same way again. If human behavior fascinates you, and you enjoy seeing what most people overlook, consider subscribing to Shadow Insight. And before we begin, tell me in the comments, have you ever been ignored by someone without ever knowing why? Watch carefully. Most people expect rejection to be loud. They expect arguments, harsh words, doors slammed shut. But human nature rarely works that way. The most powerful form of rejection is often invisible. It arrives as unanswered messages, shorter conversations, delayed replies, plans that somehow never happen. Nothing dramatic, just enough distance to make you question your own perception. Have you ever noticed how quickly your mind starts searching for explanations? Maybe they're just busy. They probably have a lot going on. I shouldn't overthink it. And sometimes, that's true. People have responsibilities. Life becomes complicated. Not every delayed response carries hidden meaning. But with time, you begin to notice something else. When someone consistently values you, they usually find a way to maintain the connection, even if they're overwhelmed, even if they're exhausted. The effort may become smaller, but it rarely disappears completely. Human relationships leave patterns, and patterns reveal far more than isolated moments. Imagine two coworkers. One of them greets everyone every morning. Then one day, he walks past only one person without saying a word. The next day, he does it again. Then again. Nothing is openly hostile, no insults, no confrontation. Yet the message becomes impossible to ignore, because silence has become selective. The same thing happens in friendships. Someone who once shared everything with you suddenly shares everything with everyone else, except you. You weren't removed from their life overnight. You were gradually removed from their attention. And attention is where relationships truly exist. Most people believe communication creates relationships, but that's only half the truth. Consistent attention is what keeps relationships alive. The moment attention is intentionally withdrawn, something fundamental has already changed. The silence is rarely the beginning. It's usually the consequence of an invisible shift that happened long before anyone noticed. And that's where most people make their biggest mistake. They focus on the silence itself, instead of asking what changed beneath the surface. Watch carefully. People rarely withdraw their attention without a reason. The reason is simply not the one they admit. Have you ever wondered why someone can seem deeply interested in you one week and emotionally absent the next? Because attention is not just communication. Attention is investment, and people instinctively invest where they believe they will gain something, whether that gain is emotional, social, or psychological. Jung believed that people often hide the parts of themselves they fear the most. The same is true of their motives. Very few people will openly say, "I'm ignoring you because your presence makes me uncomfortable," or "I'm distancing myself because you've become more confident than before." Instead, they'll convince themselves that they're simply too busy. It's easier to believe that story, and easier to let you believe it too. The strange thing about people is that they often avoid what forces them to confront themselves. Someone who constantly seeks validation may disappear the moment you stop giving it. Someone who quietly envies you may become distant after your success. Someone who enjoyed feeling superior may slowly pull away once you no longer need their approval. From the outside, it looks like random silence. Underneath, it's emotional self-protection. Adler believed that much of human behavior is driven by the need to protect one's sense of significance. When that feeling is threatened, people don't always attack. Sometimes, they simply disappear. Because distance is safer than confrontation. Ignoring someone becomes a way of regaining emotional control without ever having to explain anything. That's why silence often says more than words ever could. Words can be manipulated. Silence is much harder to fake over time. Have you ever noticed that the people who suddenly ignore you often continue giving their attention to everyone else? They're active on social media. They're replying to others. They're making plans. They're laughing. They're present, just not with you. That detail changes everything. Because the issue was never a lack of time, it was a change in emotional priority. And once you begin to see attention as a form of psychological investment, being ignored stops feeling mysterious. It becomes a clue that something invisible has already changed inside the other person. Watch carefully. Most people believe they are ignored because they did something wrong, but human nature is rarely that simple. Sometimes, you are ignored precisely because you changed. Have you ever noticed how certain relationships become uncomfortable the moment you stop chasing approval? The moment you become calmer, more confident, less available, something shifts. Not inside you, inside them. Nietzsche once suggested that people don't simply seek truth, they seek conditions that allow them to feel secure. And nothing disturbs that security more than someone who no longer plays the expected role. The friend who always needed reassurance suddenly becomes independent. The colleague who stayed quiet begins speaking with confidence. The partner who tolerated everything starts setting boundaries. To an outside observer, these changes look healthy. To someone who benefited from the old dynamic, they can feel like a loss of control. This is where silence becomes a weapon, not because people consciously plan it, but because withdrawing attention creates uncertainty, and uncertainty creates emotional pressure. The ignored person starts asking questions. Did I say something wrong? Should I apologize? Maybe I need to reach out again. Without saying a single word, the balance of power begins to shift. The person being ignored starts moving toward the one who stepped away. The other person barely has to do anything. Human nature always reveals itself eventually. Many people don't crave conflict, they crave influence. And silence is one of the quietest ways to test how much influence they still have over someone else's emotions. The moment you begin chasing answers, they receive confirmation. Your attention is still centered on them. Your emotional energy still belongs to them. That's why selective silence can become so powerful. Not because it contains information, but because your mind rushes to fill the empty space with fear, hope, guilt, and imagination. The uncomfortable truth is this: being ignored is not always an attempt to make you disappear. Sometimes, it's an attempt to make you come back on someone else's terms. And the more desperately you try to break that silence, the more control you may unknowingly give away. Watch carefully. There is one final truth that most people never consider. Being ignored doesn't just reveal something about the other person, it reveals something about you. Not because you deserve to be ignored, but because your reaction exposes where your emotional security truly lives. Have you ever wondered why one person's silence can completely consume your thoughts, while another person's absence barely affects you? The difference isn't the silence, it's the meaning you've attached to it. When someone's attention becomes tied to your sense of worth, their withdrawal feels like a verdict. You stop asking, why are they acting this way? And you start asking, what's wrong with me? That is the moment silence becomes dangerous, not because of what the other person is doing, but because you've allowed their behavior to define your identity. The strange thing about people is that they often measure themselves through other people's reactions. Approval feels like proof. Rejection feels like failure. Attention feels like value. But human behavior doesn't work that way. A person's decision to ignore you often reflects their priorities, their fears, their insecurities, or the role they expected you to keep playing. It does not automatically reflect your value. With time, you begin to notice something remarkable. Emotionally grounded people don't panic when someone becomes distant. They observe, they pay attention to patterns. They accept what the behavior is communicating instead of desperately searching for words that may never come. Because silence is still communication. Sometimes, it's the clearest communication you'll ever receive. When someone repeatedly chooses not to make space for you in their life, believe the choice, not the excuses your mind invents to protect you. There comes a moment when chasing explanations becomes more damaging than accepting reality. And that's the hidden freedom most people never reach. The moment you stop needing an explanation, You also stop giving silence the power to control your emotions. Because the greatest mistake isn't being ignored, it's abandoning your own peace while waiting for someone else to acknowledge your existence. The people who truly value your presence rarely force you to question whether you matter. And once you understand that, you stop fearing silence. You start understanding it. People never ignore you by accident, at least not consistently. Tonight, we've uncovered something most people spend years misunderstanding. Silence is rarely empty. It often carries a message that words are unwilling to deliver. We saw how attention quietly shapes every relationship, how distance can reveal hidden emotional priorities, how silence can become a subtle form of influence, and perhaps most importantly, how our own reaction to being ignored reveals where we've placed our sense of worth. The promise at the beginning of this video was that you would discover the invisible mechanism behind silence. Here it is. People don't always ignore you because you lack value. Sometimes they ignore you because your presence no longer serves their emotional needs. Sometimes because you've changed. Sometimes because they want control. Sometimes because they don't know how to confront the truth directly. But whatever the reason, silence is still a decision. And every repeated decision reveals a relationship more honestly than 1,000 reassuring words ever could. The moment you stop chasing explanations, you begin seeing people as they truly are. Not through what they say, but through what they consistently choose to do. I am the watcher, and here in Shadow Insight, we don't fear uncomfortable truths. We observe them. If this perspective changed the way you see human behavior, subscribe to Shadow Insight, leave a like, and tell me in the comments, has someone's silence ever revealed a truth you weren't ready to accept? Because in the end, what if the people who ignore you aren't revealing your worth, but exposing their own hidden motives?